Hi, Sunday school teachers. Thank you for joining us. We are looking this time at the Explore the Bible Sunday School Bible Study lesson for Job 14, 1 through 14 for Sunday, June 13th with the title Hope Defined. Now, if you've been teaching through this, you know we have skipped a huge section of Job here, all the way from chapter 1 to chapter 14. Let me just say, as a pastor, I think you should have the flexibility as a Sunday school teacher or Bible study leader to look at some of those passages in between. For example, chapter 2, Job and his wife's responses to his suffering. And if after prayer you think your class needs some of those scriptures, you have the freedom to do that. I'm telling you, as a pastor of our First Baptist Angleton folks, you do have the freedom to do that. If you are teaching at one of the other churches and you're just following along with this video, that's my opinion, that you should have that freedom, but I'm going to advise you follow your pastor or Sunday school director or your education minister on that. But our focus for this video is the Lifeway focus passage for June 13th, which is Job 14, 1 through 14. And it is a great section dealing with some of the biggest issues in life. I usually like to try to give you some way you could introduce the lesson. Getting started on the right foot's a good thing. One way you could begin your class time is by asking, has any of you had a conversation recently with somebody regarding death? Maybe somebody who is sick and dying, maybe a child or another family member. You could get some great responses to that, people talking about death that would be a good lead-in to this lesson. I read where Agatha Christie was reading her biography, and she said in it that she's, of course, the famous mystery writer. She said she could never understand why so many people are reluctant to mention anything about death when it comes to us all. She said, but really, death is so important nowadays, one has to discuss it. I just thought that was a great quote. So many people just don't even want to talk about death when it comes to us all, and it is very, very important. And this lesson does address some of the great issues of life and death. So a couple ways you could begin your lesson, or you could do it another way that God leads you to. But for a little bit of context, chapter 14 here follows the tragedies that happened to Job, the discussions he had about why they happened with his so-called friends. This chapter is part of Job's answer to Zophar from chapter 11. And getting into the text here, the first verse talks about the brevity and difficulty of life. He says, anyone born of woman is short of days and full of trouble. He talks about two things here. In number one, he says life just seems too short. And number two, life is full of trouble. All kinds of examples of that. Verse 2 expands on his idea of the brevity of life and gives two illustrations. He says, one, life's like a flower that comes forth and withers. Cheryl and I have a beautiful hibiscus bush right out in the front office window where I read. I love when one of those pretty red flowers just blooms. But a lot of times I'll see it in the morning, maybe when I'm having my quiet time, come home at night, and it'll have already withered up. It's just so quickly. It doesn't last long. And Job says that's what life is like. And he says the second example he gives, his life flees like a shadow. A shadow can just be gone in a second and does not remain. But he says not only is life short, he says it's also full of trouble. Anybody here experience trouble? I mean, that's an absurd question because everybody has. Trouble is just a characteristic of this life. It's part of the curse that sin brought into the world, which is part of the explanation for the suffering that we experience. As we talked about last time, all suffering is not directly a result of our own personal sin, but sin brought a curse into the world that does result in myriads and myriads of troubles that afflict us. Then the next verse 3, is another important section, an opportunity to teach an important doctrine, and that is our universal sin and our accountability to God. He says, you open your eyes on him, on man, and bring him into judgment with yourself. See, Job had to be thinking about his life and his standing before God. And so he says, who can stand when God opens his eyes on him and brings him into judgment? And of course, the answer is nobody can. One of my favorite verses is Psalm 130, verses 2 and 3, where he says, oh, if you, Lord, should mark iniquities, O Lord, who could stand? In other words, all of us have sinned and fall short. Now, the end of that verse of Psalm 130 gives hope. It says, but there is forgiveness with you, that you may be feared. But Job's not there yet. Right here, he's talking about how God's eyes are on us. He's judging us, and none of us can escape it. Folks, this is one of those doctrines, teachers, that we need to keep in front of our people all the time. The doctrine of the depravity of man, that we are all sinners by nature and by choice. And this is taught all through Scripture. Psalm 14 says, "The Lord's looked down from heaven upon the sons of men to see if there are any who understand, who seek after God." And of course, the answer is they've all turned aside. There's none who does good, not even one. And of course, that's quoted along with some other scriptures in Romans 3:10, which gives a whole list of these things and ends, "For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God." Listen, one of the things we need to make sure our class understands is this idea of the depravity, the sinfulness of all mankind, that all of us have sinned. Make sure your class knows that Christianity is not about us being so good and getting to heaven. No, Christianity is about us being so bad, but God had mercy and sent Jesus to save us. But we see this idea of the universality of sin here. No one can escape the holy gaze and the judgment of God who is examining our lives. And then verse 4 kind of follows that up, talking about the hopelessness of salvation on our part. Who can make the clean of the unclean? And he just answers that, no one. That pictures the whole spiritual life of mankind apart from Jesus Christ. We've all sinned. We've all sinned, and none of us can save ourselves. Jeremiah 13:23 says, "Can the leopard change his spots?" The answer is, of course he can't. And neither can we wash and save ourselves. It just throws us all on the grace of God in Jesus Christ. Only He can save us. Now, if you look at verses 7 and 9, gives what is a very real picture to many of us in South Texas now, having had once-in-a-generation winter storm that killed so many trees. Cheryl and I lost our avocado trees. We lost our hibiscus bush we had out in front. We lost our satsuma trees. But verse 7 says there's hope for a tree when it's cut down, that it will sprout again. Some of you, especially here in South Texas, that have seen a bunch of trees die, some of you could ask, are you seeing that happen on some of your trees? Are you seeing where some of them are kind of sprouting again? I've seen some little sprouts are coming back. But he says in verse 12, he compares man to the tree. He says in verses 10 and 12, he says, but man dies, and where is he? He says the tree might grow back, but what about man? We won't live again in this life, but is there something ahead for us? Now, for those counting, this is another one of those questions of Job I talked about last week. You can go through this book and just keep track of all the different questions. I think it'd be a great study, a great compilation, just to take all the questions of Job that are so deep throughout this book. And this is one of those, if you're keeping track and writing those things down. If man dies, where is he? See, Job doesn't have the full revelation of God that we have today. Many people believe this to be the oldest book in the Bible. If it is, he didn't know much of even what the Old Testament teaches, much less the promise we have today in Jesus. This is the idea of what theologians call progressive revelation. God reveals more and more of himself throughout the Bible until his final revelation in Jesus in the New Testament. But you've got to remember, Job didn't have all that yet. Here's another application, though. The sad thing is, a lot of people don't have that revelation yet because they haven't heard. So that's why we've got to be sharing the gospel. That's why we have to be doing personal evangelism. That's why we need to be supporting our missionaries and going on mission trips. Many people still don't have that hope until we share the full revelation that God has given us in Jesus. But the real focus of this lesson, I think, really is this last verse, verse 14. The great question. Talk about questions of Job. The great question, this is one of the best in the whole book. If a man dies, will he live again? Really, this is one of the most important questions, not only in the book of Job, but in all of human existence. If a man dies, will he live again? In other words, is there life after death? It's one of the single most discussed questions of mankind. So as such, you might want to spend a lot of time in your class on this verse. You may want to focus your whole lesson just on this one verse, however God leads you. But for one thing, you could talk about the different answers to this question that people give. You might ask your class, what are some of the answers that people give to this question? If a man dies, will he live again? And can you name maybe some examples of people who believe some of these things? I can see 4 different answers at least to this question. Maybe you can come up with others. I can see 4. Number 1, if a man dies, will he live again? Number 1, no. Number 2, maybe. Number 3, continually. Number 4, yes. Number 1, some say no. If a man dies, he'll not live again. That's the materialist, humanist position. They think this life is all there is. It's not new to these days. Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, hundreds of years ago, was an early believer in this. He had a dozen children, most of whom died in infancy. And his sorrow just consumed him, as did the prospect of his own death. And he wrote in his book, Meditations, talking to himself in his meditations, he says, in a short while you will be no one and nowhere, as are Hadrian and Augustus, the Caesars before him. So he said, no, we're not going to live again. Shortly I'm going to be no one, I'm going to be nowhere. That's the answer, no. Number 2, some people say maybe. That's the agnostics. They don't know. Epicurus was a Greek philosopher, and he claimed not to believe in the afterlife, but he also wrote, if we could be sure that death was annihilation, there would be no fear of it. For as long as we exist, death is not there, and when it does come, we no longer exist. But we cannot be totally sure there is annihilation. For what people fear most is not that maybe death is annihilation, but maybe death is not. So he was unsure, and there's a lot of people like today, like Epicurus. They're unsure. They don't really know. Then number 3, there are those who say, yeah, we will live again continually. They believe in reincarnation. We will keep on living again and again. Hindus, for example, believe in a continual cycle of life and death and rebirth, fitting to the life that you just lived, which is what they call karma. If you live poorly, you'll be punished. Next time you'll come back as something worse, like a frog or whatever. Hopefully you'll live a better life and you'll come back as something better. But they believe in a continual cycle of life and death and rebirth. So their answer to the question would be, if a man dies, will he live again? They'll say, yes, continually. He'll keep on doing it. But then, of course, number 4, there's the Christian answer. If a man dies, will he live again? And the Christian answer is yes, a certain yes. And in fact, that's the difference that hope in Christ makes. And you might share the gospel, share the plan of salvation here, especially if you have lost people or people you're not certain about their salvation in your class. Through Christ, we can have confidence in the face of death. And that confidence that Christian people have in the face of death is, number 1 of the biggest differences between the Christian and the non-Christian, the confidence that we have in death. And number 2, it is one of the best witnesses that we have to the lost. I'm going to recommend to you a resource, Richard E. Simmons III, not to be confused with the exercise guru, but Richard E. Simmons III has a great new book on apologetics. I've shared a couple of quotes from him today. And it has a great number of stories and examples in it. I would highly recommend you get a hold of it. Richard E. Simmons III. But in his book, he tells a story of Dr. David Nelson, a 19th century physician who sat at the bedside of many of his patients as they lay dying. He wrote about those experiences of watching these people die. He looked in the faces of the terminally ill patients and watched many of them die with no religious faith, and they would try to keep a brave face. But he said, I could see their fear in their countenance, and it was chilling. He said many people just die what he called cowardly deaths. And for many years, he did not believe in God. But he witnessed the death of many Christians as well. And as he looked into their faces, he says he noted a sense of tranquility. He wrote, I beheld more celestial triumph than I had ever witnessed anywhere else. In their voice there was a sweetness. In their eye was a glory that I never would have believed had I not been there to see it. And David Nelson eventually came to faith in Jesus Christ to a great degree because he saw the reality of the difference that Jesus makes in dying Christians. Folks, that is the Christian hope. That's the answer we have to the question. If a man dies, will he live again? Our answer is yes. We know we will, and it makes a difference in our lives. Of course, Job was still working through this in a sense. He didn't have the full revelation that we do today, but we do have it. We have the full revelation of Jesus Christ in the New Testament, and if we have our trust in him, we have every reason to be confident in the face of death. This lesson gets to the heart of some of the biggest issues in life. If a man dies, will he live again? It's deep, it's strong, it's a great opportunity to share the gospel and our Christian hope in your class, especially if there's some lost folks in there. I hope this overview's helped you in some way. If it has, I hope you'll hit like or comment, because YouTube will use that feedback to share this video with other teachers who are looking for some help on Sunday. So thank you for joining us. Hope to see you again next week.